Amen. Amen. So this whole year we've been asking the question, what is it our rabbi did? What are some of the practices our rabbi did? And what are some of the practices that we can adopt as a way of spiritual disciplines and as a way of growing? And surprisingly, one of the things that we started off the year with is he practiced solitude. Jesus got away into the quiet, into the stillness, just to be with his Father. But on the other side of solitude was this idea of community, that Jesus retreated into solitude, but he always re-engaged with community. So if we could go to the next slide, here's how we're going to define community. So the practice of community is the intentional discipline of actively building a highly relational, joyfully connected kinship groups that eat and laugh and pray and worship and follow Jesus together as family. And there's a lot of good words there that we sort of unraveled last week. This idea of a family, that back then family was your closest group. It wasn't your friends, it was your family. And this idea of it's a discipline and it's intentional. We have to build community. Community does not happen on accident. And there's so much working against us that draws us away from actually building community. Last week we talked about how many of us were raised in the West around this idea of radical individualism. Radical individualism is just the idea that we put our needs in front of the needs of the group. Right? And there's so many reasons for you and I to not engage in community. I can use the reason or the excuse of self-care. That I really have to worry about myself, that I really have to take care of things I need to do, and I can push community aside, and it can sound totally valid because I need to look out for myself, my mental health, my time, my resources, my energy. There are so many more alluring things out there that seemingly will satisfy us that doesn't require community. There's so many experiences you and I could have that doesn't require community, that feels like it's going to be so satisfying and so fulfilling. There's so many things that we could do that seem much more enjoyable and do so much for us as people and individuals that we don't even have to consider how our absence affects the community as a whole. This world is set up so it could be all about us, and we can make it seem very, very justified. Or there's counterfeit versions of community where we might feel accepted and we might feel part of something, but if it's not Christ-centered, that's not the community we're building. So there's a lot working against us in terms of this discipline of community. And so last week we talked about how that in the early church was not centered around a teaching or a service. This is not community. This might somewhat build community, but this gathering where we sit individually and just listen to this person ranting is not community. The way that the church built community was built around something else. Luke chapter 22, verse 19, Jesus says this, "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" What is Jesus telling his followers? When I'm gone, keep doing this thing. Practice this thing. What are they doing? What is the thing they're supposed to do? They're sharing a meal. They're sharing a meal. They're sitting around a table. And so the point last week was that Christian community, spiritual growth, spiritual formation doesn't necessarily just happen here or in a Bible study. A lot of Christian community and Christian growth actually happens around a meal. And the early church embraced this right away in what they called agape feasts. And what they would do is they would share a meal and they would also have communion. At some point around 250 AD, those things became separate. So there was this separate meal, the separate agape feast, and the separate time of communion. And of course, there are issues about that. Paul writes in Corinth how these meals would devolve into shows of gluttony, or the rich people would, maybe if it was a potluck, maybe the rich people would bring really good food, make the poorer people feel bad. I don't know, there are all sorts of issues, and community's messy, right? And this actually faded out of practice around the late 7th century. The church stopped doing these agape feasts. And where it came back was after the Reformation, when you had the Moravians, and John Wesley actually introduced these feasts as a way to celebrate Eucharist or communion. But after the 1900s, the church again stopped doing these sort of feasts. But all I want to point out is early on in church history, and what Jesus told his disciples is, if you want to build community, if you want to remember me, do it around a meal. Do it around a table, right? And so we took the step this week of inviting Joy and her kids to our house to have dinner. We've lived within shouting distance of each other for over a year, and has never happened, right? And so we said, well, we should probably practice what we preach. And so my wife invited them over, and I wasn't there, but I heard it was great. And very entertaining watching kids play Mario Kart, right? So it happens around a meal. My community group that meets on Thursdays, right? We don't meet around a Bible study. We don't meet at church, and that's purposeful, and I think that's awesome. We meet around a meal. We either go out to eat or we meet at a coffee shop. And I'll tell you this, every single time I go to community group, my problems aren't solved, my prayers aren't answered, but I feel very encouraged and very rejuvenated. I feel very blessed, and I feel ready to go and ready to fight the good fight again. Nothing has changed. My situation is still the same, right? My prayer requests are still the same. But something about sharing a meal together actually activates something in my spirit and in my brain that helps me feel so encouraged to continue to pursue Christ. So what's going on there, right? Why is it that I walk away feeling so joyful, so full, when all we're doing is sharing a meal? Well, there's actually a reason for that. In his book, Hacking the American Mind, Dr. Robert Lustig points out that you and I have confused pleasure with happiness. We have confused pleasure with happiness. So pleasure is actually associated with the chemical in our brain called dopamine. You can get pleasure by simply eating candy. Did you know that? Eating candy, eating sugar, or my daily habit of pearl milk tea brings a lot of pleasure because it releases dopamine in my brain. The problem with pleasure is it is short-lived. It is visceral. I can experience pleasure alone. That's why I can be on my own, and I'm perfectly, in my mind, happy. And I confuse it for happiness, but it's actually pleasure. Because I don't need anybody to help me experience pleasure. I can get it through substances, whether that's sugar or alcohol. I can feel pleasure by looking at social media. And guilty, I experience pleasure when I do online shopping. Who is guilty of that? It is, right? Because dopamine gets activated in your brain. However, happiness is more associated with serotonin. Happiness is long-lived. It is more ethereal. It is not something that you can just grasp quickly, and it lasts, and it's often achieved by giving. You cannot achieve it through substances. But here's the key, and here's why when I walk away of community group, I feel very encouraged. Serotonin and happiness is often experienced best around other people and social groups. So that's why when God tells us to gather, he knows how we are wired. And he knows that we're not going to just experience pleasure, we're going to experience happiness. It's going to be serotonin when we gather together in groups. But here's what's crazy. High levels of dopamine suppress serotonin. What does that mean? The more pleasure you seek, the less happy you actually are, because those chemicals don't play well together. So the more you feed your mind with sugar, feed your body with sugar and experiences, your pleasure center is firing, but your happiness center of your brain is dying. And so what the studies have shown is peak human happiness, the most maximal serotonin level actually happens when we're in a group, sharing a meal, sitting around the table. Isn't that interesting? Isn't God so smart, right? He knows how our brain works. But here's the challenge that we always face when we gather around a table. How do we prevent our meals from devolving into just dinner with friends? Not all of us are millennial, but we've grown up in millennial culture. Millennial culture is all about hanging out. Millennial culture is just satisfied with shallow versions of hanging out. How do we prevent our meals from turning into just hanging out or gossip sessions or complaint sessions? How many of you have ever been in a meal or a gathering and it just devolves into gossip or complaints? And there's actually no benefit. It's not helping your happiness level. You probably leave more depressed or upset. Right? So how do we prevent it from just staying on the surface or devolving into something else and instead be something deeper? John Eldredge writes about 3 layers of conversation. First one is called the shallows. This is just basic chit-chat. This is what my kids think adults talk about, which is the weather, stocks, and taxes, right? So it's just basic, like, oh, how, did you see the game last night, or isn't it so hot? That's just shallow kind of conversation. Then he defines what he calls the Midlands, which gets a little bit deeper. You might ask, how was your week? That invites something a little bit deeper in terms of the conversation. And then there's the depths, where you get under the surface, where you might say in a conversation, I'm carrying around a lot of resentment towards my friends, or I'm carrying around a lot of resentment towards my family, or I'm struggling with this and I don't know what to do, or, those kind of conversations. So how do we, as a Christian community, start to move our conversations and our hanging out more towards the depths? Not that you have to get there every time, because that is exhausting, but we want substance and not just superficial, okay? So I'll tell you one practical way. And this is going to sound really corny, but hear me out. These feasts that the church participated in were called agape feasts for a reason. It was a lot about love, okay? And within love, a part of love is actually this idea of joys. So I'm going to give you a very simple thing to think about. Maybe the way that we can practice community in an authentic way, the way we can get our community to get to the depth instead of just the shallows, is simply just sharing each other's joys. Just sharing in each other's joys. Do you know you have a joy center in your right side of your prefrontal cortex? And that is arguably one of the parts of the brain that never stops growing. You can ask Angela. I don't actually know if there is. Right? That is one of the few parts of your brain that can keep learning and growing. By the time you're my age, there are certain skills I will never pick up. Okay, in fact, you lose balance as you get older, as I experienced yesterday falling off a bike. But, right, joy can keep developing. Joy can keep growing, right? That's why the most joyful people are actually a lot of older people. I know they're also grumpy, but if you actually meet older people that practice joy, they're the happiest people in the world, okay? Maybe because they don't have much of a care in the world. But here's the problem. We are sinners. Our brain and our hearts are not predisposed to joy because we are damaged by sin. Our minds go more towards the negative. You know what the ratio is of negative to positive thoughts? Studies show 14-1. That is crazy. Our thoughts bent 14 negative thoughts for every 1 positive thought. Negativity is very attractive to our minds. Positivity, we tend to reject. Research says that our thoughts are 80% negative and 95% repetitive. Do you know people like this? You do, because you're one of them too, right? Research shows that our brains are 80% negative and 95% repetitive, meaning what usually goes on in here is an endless loop of fears and complaints and anxieties and hurts and resentments. That's what's going on in our brain 95% of the time, according to studies, right? We have a tendency to fall into chaos. So the challenge is, joy is not our default state as sinners. But we have to tackle this because one thing I know is that our God is the most joyful being in the universe. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 11. It says, with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God. That word blessed can actually be translated as happy. So I could read it with the gospel of the glory of the happy God or the joyful God. I don't know how many of us think of God as joyful. How many think of God as celebrating? We don't, but the Bible makes it clear. Our God is a joyful, happy God, and in fact, the most joyful being in the universe. Psalm 16, verse 11 says, you make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures evermore. Your relationship with God is meant to result in joy. Spending time with God is meant to activate joy, a joy that doesn't just depend on what's happening, but some sort of inner joy. That's why Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 9 says at the end, Nehemiah is saying all these things, and a very famous line at the end, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Where are we drawing our strength from? I don't often think about when I need strength, I don't think about drawing it from the joy of the Lord, whatever that means. I draw strength from myself, I draw strength from my experience, right? But the source of joy is meant to be our relationship with God, and the source of our strength is meant to be the joy that we get from God. Think about the fruit of the Spirit, right? Singular fruit. What's the second fruit after love? Joy. It's got to be important. It has to be really critical to how we operate as followers of Christ, both individually and in community. It's critical. There's actually a lot of dangers if you lack joy in your life. I realize this must be really awkward for Joy right now. Okay, so here are some of the dangers. I made it more awkward by pointing it out. Okay, so it turns out low joy people are prone to sin. Why are low joy people prone to sin? Because the devil convinces you that you're empty and that you're sad, and what can fulfill you? This sin. Low joy people are prone to sin because we, as if we are low joy people, are prone to believe that sin will make us happy and provide the relief that we're not experiencing. There is a pastor that I used to listen to back in California, and he would speak at like 3 or 4 services every Saturday and Sunday. There was just a big church. And he confessed that every Monday he was so devoid of joy. He was so burned out. He was so empty that's when the devil would get him, and he would fall into all sorts of sin, whether that's alcohol or pornography or all these things, all because he was lacking joy and just completely drained, right? Low joy people are prone to sin. Secondly, low joy relationships are actually prone to fracture. Studies have shown that stable marriages need a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions, especially if you're in conflict. So if you are fighting with your spouse or your friend or any sort of relationship, right, if you do not have a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative, that becomes brittle and that becomes dangerous because now there's no buffer and there's no anchor of happiness and joy to help you get through the more difficult conversations you have. There's nothing to absorb the shocks in a relationship if it is a low joy relationship. And, talking about the church, low joy communities are prone to fall apart. There's a lot of communities out there, mainly online, that form in opposition to something. There's a lot of communities online that form just because they're against something. And then when that thing disappears, the community falls apart because it was built on negativity. And actually what studies show is they start to turn on each other, right? Take any political figure you hate. You can find a group that hates that political figure. Once that political figure is out of office, they don't have anywhere for the hate to go, so it turns on each other and it falls apart, right? Low joy communities are prone to fall apart, and that's very true in the church. That's why Proverbs chapter 17, verse 22 says, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up bones. There's something about lacking joy that is so detrimental to how God created us to be and how the community could look. But on the flip side, we see a community in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 that actually is held together by joy. Here's what Paul writes. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches in Macedonia. For in severe tests of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. So this had to do with, I think, giving donations to help the church in Jerusalem. And what is Paul saying? There's this church in Macedonia that was poor, extreme poverty. They didn't have anything, but they had joy. And that community came together to give abundantly to the cause. So we see that there is, even as a community is suffering and struggling, if a big part of how they build each other up and interact and a source of strength comes from joy, God can use that community to accomplish so much. But here's the thing. These are called spiritual disciplines. It turns out there is a discipline to joy. Henry Nouwen says this: joy does not simply happen to us. We have to choose joy and keep choosing it every day. Joy, the discipline of joy, the practice of joy has to be very, very active. Our culture highly values authenticity, and I think that's good. But what that has sometimes done is it makes us feel like it is morally wrong to express joy if I don't feel joyful. I do not mean that you fake it, right? I've been at churches where you have to smile, or, oh, something's wrong with you, right? You must be far from God if you're not smiling, right? Pastor Rick Warren, his son died by suicide, right? And that brought this whole thing of mental health to the church forefront. And before, the church would be like, you just need to pray away depression, right? There's realities where we are not always feeling joy. But we confuse that because what we don't understand is we can actually do things that build our joy without faking that we're joyful even when we're not. And I'll just give you, just really quickly, one of the things you can do is just share your highlights of the week. Everyone has some highlight. And another thing you can do is just practice gratitude. Just share what you're thankful for. Really simple, really corny, but it actually helps you practice joy when you are not necessarily in a joyful situation. And it has to be done in community, because what we found is that joy is a relational experience. Joy is a relational experience. Neuropsychologists from UCLA define joy as what happens to your brain when you are happy to be with someone who is happy to be with you. Okay, let me explain what that means, right? Have you ever been in a situation? So sometimes, I'll come home and I'll see my wife, right? And if she smiles at me, what does that tell me? She's happy to see me, right? Right? So what does that do? That makes me really happy. Joy is connection. So some of the purest forms of joy, where our brain fires its joy centers the most, actually is in those relationships where you come and you sit down in a space and you can just tell whoever you're with loves you for who you are and is just happy to see you. That's how we as a community, and that's why we as a community need to be very intentional and deliberate about practicing joy. And it's hard, but I think it's important. Here's why. Corporations understand that what you and I are addicted to is dopamine and not serotonin. Corporations know that what we want or what we're addicted to is pleasure, but we don't understand that what we need is happiness and joy. So a lot of the industry around us uses things that stroke our anger, our negativity, our FOMO, and actually rob us of joy but feed our pleasure centers. So wouldn't it be great to see the people of God rebel against that? And instead of being a community that seeks pleasure, we are a community that lives out joy in community together, building one another up. Bono, famous theologian Bono, actually said this: joy is an act of defiance. It is. Joy is an act of defiance because everything around us is trying to rob us of joy and point us to pleasure. So what a witness it would be, what a light it would be if the world would see a community come together that experiences and practices joy instead of just seeking pleasure. So today, by way of just discussion, if we could put up the questions, here is just something to think about. Some is somewhat unrelated. How social do you consider yourself to be? How does that influence your desire or capacity for sharing a weekly meal in community, right? If we are going to build community, it requires us to get together. So how does that impact you? Does the act of celebrating, whether it's celebrating yourself or someone else, feel natural or unnatural? Why? And then I would just say share a joy with the group. Okay, really simple. And as usual, you don't have to talk about any of these, as long as you're praying for each other, right? I mean, the main thing is that we get together and pray, but these are just good talking points to discuss. So let me just pray really quick, and then we'll share. Dad, we just thank you so much that you are a God of joy who wants to give joy to his children, especially in a world that has conditioned us to be about negativity and really view positivity as maybe not authentic, but you want to bring joy and happiness into this world. God, we also thank you that you challenge us to do that in the context of community, especially in a world where we are told to look out for ourselves, that we instead would be a people that would give to others and in that experience real happiness and not just pleasure. So empower us to live this out in the context of this church. Help us to continue to build each other up. Help us to see things to be thankful for. Help us to see things to share in each other's joys. We thank you, and in your name, amen.